On the 28th of June 1914, the much disliked Archduke Franz Ferdinand was visiting Sarajevo during a Serb holiday. He was hated in Austria, but he and the rest of his failing Habsburg dynasty were hated so much more in Serbia. So to visit the Serbian-populated Bosnia at all was dangerous, but during a holy day of mourning was most unwise. During his journey to the town hall he was visiting, his motorcade was attacked by would-be assassins. 2 of the planned bombers had failed to act, but the third threw a bomb under one of the cars, injuring up to 20 people. While the Archduke went on with his speech at the town hall, one of the members of the assassination team, Gavrilo Princip, went to a cafe to possibly eat a sandwich. Whether or not this position was chosen by Princip to try and catch the Archduke on his way back is unknown, but the Archduke did indeed pass that cafe after a fatal wrong turn by the driver, who stopped the car outside to turn it around. This gave Princip the opportunity he needed, and by the end of the day, both the Archduke and his wife were dead. This famously was the direct cause of World War I, and sometimes this fact is taken for granted. But how did the assassination of this Austrian member of a failing dynasty cause Germany to invade France? Well, let's take a look at the diplomatic fallout of the assassination, and how individuals and countries used the events to start a war that just got bigger and bigger. So how did Austria-Hungary react to the murder of the heir to the Habsburg throne? Well, as I mentioned before, Franz Ferdinand wasn't particularly popular, but while he was not well mourned, many in Austria saw the attack as a dangerous political statement that could not be ignored. The emperor himself, Franz Josef, was disturbed, but took no action, instead leaving the decision-making to his officials, who were caught in a debate on whether or not to do anything about it. In Berlin, the Kaiser received the news ferociously. Germany at this point was still a monarchy, and believed that the king was above all others in the country, and therefore to kill a king was perhaps the greatest crime of all. But in addition to this, Kaiser Wilhelm II and Archduke Franz Ferdinand had been good friends growing up, and had gone on long hunting trips together. He wanted action to be taken, and immediately. The wider political scope of this also cannot be ignored. Austria was Germany's ally, but it would probably be a little more accurate to say that Austria was Germany's pet. Berlin would have seen the faltering and failing of Austria and would have wanted to save her from inevitable collapse. So, 3 days after the Archduke was shot in Sarajevo, Germany sent Austria what became known as the blank check, effectively guaranteeing German military support should Austria need it, and heavily encouraging Austrian military action against Serbia. Well, what's Serbia got to do with all this? 6 years earlier, in 1908, Austria-Hungary annexed the lands where the Archduke would be shot, which Serbia protested to and demanded they should have those lands. The Bosnian crisis, as it became known, ended in humiliation for both Serbia and her ally and protector, Russia, who were forced to back down. So, when Franz Ferdinand was shot by a Bosnian Serb, the question was whether or not the Serbian government was behind it. In Berlin, the Kaiser had already decided that it was. So the blank check had been sent. What next? When would Austria charge into Belgrade with all guns blazing? Well, it wouldn't quite be so dramatic quite so fast. Austria ummed and erred, and in England, the Foreign Secretary Edward Grey pushed the potential crisis to the back of his mind. For in foreign policy, there were far more pressing matters, the seemingly inevitable Irish Civil War being one of them. It seemed like the constant time bomb that was the Balkans would sort this one out between themselves, and peacefully. What happened during the next couple of weeks is really tricky to unpick, with some sources claiming that the chief of the Great German General Staff, General Moltke, tried to encourage the crisis to be drawn out in order to encourage Russian action first, as he favoured a war with Russia and hopefully France, so Germany could dominate the continent. The Kaiser, despite wanting to stay in Berlin, had gone on his annual holiday, and although he tried to keep up with what was going on, was probably expecting it to all be over when he got back. The problem, or in Moltke's case the opportunity, was that Serbia's ally and protector Russia might intervene. The great autocratic and czarist nation, or at least its leadership, would have also been furious at the murder of royalty, or so the Kaiser hoped. But the longer it dragged on, the more Russia would once again side with Serbia. The weeks dragged by, and the rest of Europe kept half an eye on the situation, thinking that nothing would really come of it. The Kaiser wasn't getting his little Balkan war, and the German High Command were getting closer to their World War. It took 3.5 weeks for the Habsburg Emperor to finally issue an ultimatum to Austria, and when he did, the other countries looking on were stunned. The ultimatum was ridiculous. Austria had acted way out of line, leaving many others to suspect that Germany had given some kind of secret guarantee for aid. It was designed to be rejected, and although Austria did not admit this publicly, it was obvious to all. Vienna had comforted Berlin before issuing the ultimatum that Serbia would be forced to reject it, giving them cause to go to war. However, to everyone's surprise, Serbia accepted nearly all of the demands, only rejecting the proposal that Austria have a hand in any and all Serbian internal inquiries, saying that this would breach their constitution. It's worth noting here that there is some debate as to whether or not this was a genuine compromise, with some arguing that instead it was just suggesting compromise but didn't actually promise anything that would encourage the Austrians not to declare war. Either way, despite Serbia's seemingly almost complete capitulation, Austria rejected their deal. Now, the rest of Europe started to realise that the war that was on the horizon wouldn't be a little Balkan war, and was more likely to escalate into a general war. In London, Prime Minister Asquith noted this in letters, but saying that Britain need not be involved. A young Winston Churchill, member of the Cabinet and First Lord of the Admiralty, expressed his indignation at the Austrian demands, but also believed that Britain would not join a general war. Nevertheless, as a precautionary measure, and possibly as a warning, the Royal Navy was placed on high alert, and reservists were not returned as usual after the ceremonial fleet review at Spithead, south of the Royal Navy base at Portsmouth. Edward Grey was urged by Paul Cambon, the French ambassador, to try to stop the pending crisis. Grey went to the German ambassador, an admirable man named Karl Max, or Prince Lichnowsky, to help him arrange a peace conference with the four European powers to try to mediate between Austria-Hungary and Serbia, the four powers being Britain, France, Germany and Italy. Grey was also personal friends with Prince Lichnowsky, and together they would try desperately to avoid the war that was coming. Grey had commented that if Serbia completely capitulated to Austria's demands, then it would cease to be an independent nation. Lichnowsky noted this in his report to Berlin, to which the Kaiser replied, "That would be very desirable. It is not a nation in the European sense, but a band of robbers." Grey's conference peace plan was a last-ditch effort to avoid war, but it was not met with celebration from all. The Russian ambassador met with Grey and expressed his opposition to it, saying that it could break apart the Triple Entente, an alliance between Britain, France and Russia that I'll get onto later. Despite his reservations, however, the Russian ambassador agreed to the conference in the interest of peace. It wasn't received quite as well in Germany, however. Wilhelm soundedly rejected the proposal, but ordered his ambassador Lichnowsky to tell Grey that Germany had no hand in the ultimatum that had been given to Serbia. So what's the Triple Entente? Let's have a look at Britain's alliance with Russia and France. It's worth noting, certainly from Britain's perspective, that the Entente didn't formally force Britain into any kind of war. It was just a friendship that had formed after mutual agreements. With Russia, the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907 had allowed cooperation in the Middle East and stopped the contention of territories like Afghanistan, and helped seal some territories from German control in the region. Britain's agreement with France came from the 1904 Entente Cordiale, a very complex series of agreements which formed a friendship between Britain and France, but was not a formal military alliance. The Anglo-French Naval Convention, an agreement drawn up in 1912, should also be noted. It effectively gave the responsibilities of the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean to the French, and the responsibilities of the French Navy in the Channel to the English, allowing both nations to preserve resources where necessary. The alliance between France and Russia, however, was a little stronger, and a lot more surprising given the difference between the two countries. Only a century after France had had an anti-monarchist revolution, they allied with the highly autocratic Tsarist Russia, two completely contrasting ideologies united in a fear of Germany. For in 1870, Prussia, Germany's predecessor, had captured Paris, leading to the unification of the German Empire. France had since toughened up its border with Germany, and Russia, fearing German expansion, had allied with France. If either one of them were to be attacked, the other one would come to the aid. After Grey's conference plans failed to act, Austria and Serbia mobilised their armies, and then Russia partially mobilised its army, showing the first escalations that were to come. If Russia were to intervene and save Serbia, then Germany would join the war, if they were not already planning to, and then France would be forced to act through their alliance with Russia. The question on everyone's mind was whether or not Britain would fight alongside France. Let's consider the differences between Germany and Britain. Germany wanted to have their own day, their own empire like Britain had. Germany had a system where the power base was concentrated at the top with the Kaiser. Britain, however, was a democracy. Not quite the democracy of modern times, but a democracy all the same. Power was placed in Parliament, as a lot of the day-to-day decision-making power that would influence how Parliament acts was with the Cabinet, a collection of all the most senior government ministers in the country. The diplomatic clash of these two different types of countries really showed the differences between them, one stuck in the past and one moving towards the future. Germany's foreign policy was made by a select few militant individuals with a desire for conquest, while impactful British foreign policy was dreamt up by the Foreign Minister, Edward Grey, and then discussed in the Cabinet, and then presented to Parliament, who would vote on it based on how best they believed they could represent their voters. Of course, those voters were a little less diverse and numerous than they are in democracies today. Anyway, back to the events at hand. Russia had partially mobilised, a move that many in the German High Command, including the Kaiser, didn't want. Those who wanted a general war, however, would have delighted at the news. Kaiser Wilhelm and Tsar Nicholas exchanged a flurry of telegrams, referring to each other as Willy and Nicky respectively, both trying to stop any more escalation, but in the end, nothing came of it. Austria finally declared war on Serbia. Prince Lichnowsky reaffirmed Britain's plea for mediation to Berlin. Germany responds by simply trying to ensure British neutrality in any war that could happen. In response to the Austrian declaration of war, Russia fully mobilises its armies. France had moved troops back from their border to encourage peace, and somebody in Germany sent word to London that they would not attack France if France agrees to stay neutral, and then some other terms that I haven't been able to get a reliable lock on the specifics of. It doesn't seem that they were terms that France would be particularly quick to accept. A cabinet meeting was held to decide what to do next. I'll do a quick roundup of the important people present. Herbert Asquith, Prime Minister, Edward Grey, Foreign Secretary, Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, and David Lloyd George, Chancellor and the prize of any debate. Lloyd George was an incredibly powerful political figure, and interestingly in this debate of war, rose to prominence opposing a different war, the Boer War of 1899 to 1902. The cabinet meeting was rough, with 3 MPs, including Lloyd George, threatening to resign if Britain were to enter a European war, which would have been a major blow for the ruling Liberal Party, and could have shattered it apart. The outcome of the meeting seemed to be that if France were to be left alone in this war, then Britain could stay neutral, and the war need not spread. However, the cabinet was secretly not willing to necessarily go to war if France were to be attacked. Grey telephoned Prince Lichnowsky to inform Berlin of what the cabinet had discussed. The details of what happened next are lost to history, but somewhere there was a misunderstanding. It's believed that Lichnowsky thought Grey was promising French neutrality if they were not attacked, even if Russia was attacked, which would mean that Germany only needed to fight a war on one front. The Kaiser received Lichnowsky's telegram minutes after he had signed for the mobilisation of the German army. For him, the news was the best, and he ordered the German army to turn around and divert all its forces to the east. General Moltke was furious and said that it could not be done, but Kaiser Wilhelm ordered it to be done anyway. As Germany mobilised, France also mobilised, unaware of the promises that Germany thought they had. In London, the French ambassador had a furious meeting with Edward Grey, where Grey informed him that the cabinet was not willing to offer its full support to France. The British government soon realised their mistake in what the Kaiser believed they had promised, and Prime Minister Asquith and Edward Grey went to the King with their dilemma, who sent a telegram to his cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm II, explaining the misunderstanding. The Kaiser was furious, and ordered Moltke to carry on with the plan to invade France, a plan that had been at the back of German military minds for nearly a decade, the Schlieffen Plan, which would use Belgium as the stepping stone to Paris. This was problematic. You see, the idea of Belgium as an independent state, although many who lived in Belgium wanted it to be independent for a long time, was brought up at the Vienna Congress after the fall of Napoleon. The Vienna Congress was key to reshaping Europe after the end of Napoleon's reign, and one of its objectives was to make sure that a single country could never take power in Europe, as France had done again. The creation of Belgium, therefore, was done to create a buffer zone between France and the German Confederation, at the time a group of states led by Prussia. Belgium was sometimes referred to as the backdoor to Paris, but also the backdoor to Berlin. In order to solidify Belgium's neutrality to stop a dominating power in Europe, the 1939 Treaty of London was signed by many European powers, including France, Britain and the German Confederation, with each of these nations pledging to guarantee Belgium's neutrality. If Germany were to break this treaty, then Britain would have far more of a cause to intervene, although some of the German High Command would have believed that Britain would not fight a war on the continent while there was an Irish Civil War looming. The idea of the 1939 Treaty of London was that the Battle of Waterloo would be the last ever battle fought in Belgium. That ideal would be shattered in the coming century, but for now it stood firm. In London, Cambon, the French ambassador, reminded Edward Grey of the agreement that they had to protect each other's assets in the Mediterranean and the Channel. Meanwhile, Germany declared war on Russia, so Prime Minister Asquith held an emergency cabinet meeting to decide Britain's fate in the war to come. The cabinet, and indeed the government as a whole, had been proud in avoiding any of the formal military alliances that the rest of Europe had been entangled into. While it was certainly friends with Russia and France, Britain was under no formal obligation to go to war. However, as Grey argued, if Britain were not to go to war and leave France alone, then there would be two eventualities at the end of the coming war. The militant Germany could stand dominant over the continent and all of Britain's friends would be gone, or Germany would fall, Europe would be scarred from the war, and Britain's friends would be gone, because no one would ever trust Britain again after they had failed France. Lloyd George stood firm, but notes exchanged between him and Winston Churchill during the cabinet meeting showed that he was starting to come around. In the end, the cabinet gave authorisation to Grey to inform Cambon that the Royal Navy would protect French assets in the Channel. Cambon wrote that in that moment he felt that the battle to secure British support had been won, believing that once war had truly started, Britain would bring its armies in to support France as well. Meanwhile, German trains were steaming towards Belgium, ready to take France in the estimated time of just 6 weeks. An ultimatum was given to the King of Belgium by Germany. Surprisingly, Belgium did not just stand down, and their government resolved to fight back any army that would try to enter its lands uninvited. In London, the government waited for a call for aid from the Belgian king. There was still no unified stance behind going to war on the continent. Edward Grey gave a passionate speech to Parliament, in support of going to war to protect France from the German steamroller, and to stick by Britain's friendship in the tripleentendre. Soon after, Germany declared war on France and started moving troops into Belgium. Belgium stood firm, resolute in its commitment to its own independence. The Belgian king then appealed to the other signatories of the 1939 Treaty of London, including Great Britain. In Asquith's cabinet, Lloyd George, as Chancellor, spoke of the economic catastrophe that the war would cause, but the violation of Belgian neutrality and the plea that came with it had cemented his mind in favour of sending troops to aid France. With Lloyd George on side, what remained of the cabinet was united, and Britain sent an ultimatum to Germany. Germany rejected the ultimatum, and on the 4th of August, Britain declared war on Germany. It felt a long way from the assassination of an Archduke of a failing empire. As Edward Grey stood at a window in the Foreign Office, he watched the lamps being lit as dusk settled, and remarked, "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime."